Today we're talking about mage builds. With the recent patch, a lot has changed from mages. Spear of the Magus is now a lot more efficient in many builds for many mages, and Spear of Desolation got a price decrease. Because of that, I thought it was time to look at the items, especially regarding early game, and kind of come up with some build options that will work with these items. So this primarily focuses on god that can make use of Spear of the Magus, not so much on the ones that are very restricted to Obsidian Shard. There are not that many mages that are restricted to Obsidian Shard at this point though, so that should not be a major problem. The god I did most of the testing with is Aquatic, because he has those clear-cut instances of damage with his dragon where you can exactly see how much extra damage you get when you go up by a tick. And that just makes it easier, but it would work with any god that has some sort of ticking damage or multiple instances of damage. So initially, my goal was to find out how Spear of the Magus and Spear of Desolation compare against each other and against Dynasty playtime on lower levels and early in the game. So I had a level 10 Aquatic with Sands of Time, Shoes of the Magi, and then the third slot would be one of those items. I tested this both against a level 10 Robot who has no extra defensive items, just the base stats, and against a Gap level 10 with Hardwood Amulet, because that gives him a decent amount of magical protection. I originally tried to implement Reinforced Greaves as well, but that kind of makes it a bit odd, because you have those stack-in protections against the stack-in protection reduction, which is a bit annoying, so I figured I might just go with Hardwood, and you would assume something like just CDR boots. In regards to the ability order, I maxed out the 2 because I wanted to try how to get the maximized dot damage here. This is something that's unusual at the moment. You would usually see Aquatic maxing his 3 first for a very high burst combo that should just be enough to shut the enemy down. I could imagine that with the upcoming patch this will change a little bit. It depends on which item you're building first. If you're looking for an early Spear of the Magus, then it makes more sense to invest into the 2 because they kind of work together very well. But just for comparison's sake here, so that each of the items I use will have the same base damage for the abilities and it's a bit more comparable. Obviously, if you were to use the 3 before you use the 2 as an ability, then the 2 will deal a little bit more damage with the Spear of the Magus, whereas the 3 will deal a little less. What I did here was using the 2 first, all the stacks of the 2, and then use the 3, which would in most cases be the ideal combo if you use Spear of the Magus at least. And then we have the compared values here. If you look at Spear of the Magus in the Ra scenario, the damage goes up from 129 to 136 for the 2, whereas the 3 does 216 damage. With Spear of Desolation, where you don't have the protection shred, you got 145 damage and 339 for the 3. And with Dynasty Playtime, which is a little cheaper and also a little weaker in regards to damage because of that, because it also has a defensive stats, you end up with 128 damage on the 2 and 214 damage on the 3. Now if you look at the max damage hits, so this is what you get with the last hit of your tech chain and the very last hit after that through the 3, you will see that obviously Spear of the Magus gets a little benefit because we're not using the earlier values here, but overall the values clearly indicate that Spear of Desolation is the strongest. This is obvious because Spear of the Desolation has that high flat pen and it has the highest power of these items. It is also a fair bit more expensive. Dynasty Playtime actually is really close to Spear of the Magus, however. This is because Ra on level 10 without any items does not have enough protections when you already have pen boots for you to really get the benefit out of the full Spear of the Magus effect, the full protection shred, protection reduction. So if your main goal is to burst squishies and survive, then Dynasty Playtime is in this scenario obviously the better option because it's cheaper. Spear of Desolation is really nice but also really expensive, so if you want to invest into that, that's an option you can go for, but you have to be aware of that extra price difference. The nice thing about Spear of the Magus and Spear of Desolation is that they build off the same items, so you can get Enchanted Spear and you will still end up being able to choose at that point. So if you need something cheap that's better against other targets, then you can go for Spear of the Magus, and if you want have like higher power, higher CDR, the highest burst possible at that stage of the game, then Spear of Desolation is really nice. Now let's compare the values for a tanky target, and with that we have the level 10 Gap with Hardwood Amulet. This is only a single magical defense item that also helps his team obviously, and what we'll see here is that Spear of the Magus deals up to 101 damage on the 2, then 161 damage on the 3 under optimal circumstances. For Desolation we have 81 damage on the 2 and 134 damage on the 3, and for Dynasty Playtime we have 73 damage on the 2 and 122 damage on the 3. So what you see here is that the damage heavily swings in favor of Spear of the Magus. Despite being cheaper than Spear of Desolation, you actually get almost 50 extra damage if we factor in that we're starting from the very last tick here. Obviously you can't always do that. If we look at the very first ticks here, the 74 damage, and assume that you were to hit one dragon and then your 3, then the damage difference would actually be slightly in favor of Spear of Desolation. Not by much, but by a little bit. So this is something worth keeping in mind. You have to be sure that you can get most of your ticks off on the target in order to be fully effective. But if you do, then this item becomes very effective. But what does this show us? Realistically, in many early scenarios, Spear of Desolation is now a lot better than it used to be because it's kinda cheap. It has a nice mix of overall stats and it provides you with a lot of damage against pretty much any target until they have more defense, because it also has that high power. Dynasty Playtime is still a very nice item and I would not underrate it against comps that have high physical damage, so you need some sort of protection in that way. But it just branches from another tree, so it gives you less flexibility when building it. The price difference may actually sound a little scary at first, because we're talking about an item that costs 2,600 gold here, but it is actually not that dramatic. If you compare this to a typical jungler pen item that was the most popular pen item with CDR for multiple seasons, talking about Jotun's Wrath, then it's actually just a 150 gold difference, and that's something that's very much bearable. It is not the most rushed early item, but it's also not that expensive anymore that you would really have to wait to build it if the situation allows for it. And a lot comes down to the situation here. If you're playing this in middle lane, then you will often be facing a magical opponent, maybe a physical jungle along with him, and at that moment then Dynasty Playtime is pretty good, because you're only gonna be facing squishies, and Dynasty Playtime is the cheapest of these items that provides the most damage in comparison against squishies, and it will help you survive the jungler's ganks. If, on the other hand, the support rotates into middle early, which we see more and more, then the scenario looks a little different, because Dynasty Playtime will not do much against the support if it's a Guardian. So if you're facing two magicals, you would have more benefit from going into the spears, and then you will see if you're gonna be aggressed on more by the enemy Guardian or by the enemy Mage, and depending on that you can choose if you want to go for Spear of the Magus or Spear of Desolation, also depending on if you fall behind or you get ahead a little bit. Obviously, you also have to always keep in mind that these items have a little bit different power curves and a little bit different clear power, which is also important, but I do think that at the moment all of these items are viable choices for clearing as well. So what could a typical build look like? Well, that once again depends on which item you start with. We're gonna leave out Dynasty Playtime here because you guys have seen builds with Dynasty Playtime. It's nothing I should have to tell you about. But let's begin with a Spear of Desolation build. So we assume we start with Sands of Time and Pen Boots as usual. And then the first item you build after would be Spear of Desolation. What should you do after? Well, you have to consider that you're probably against a more squishy comp, or you're primarily focusing squishies. That is why you went for Spear of Desolation. So at that point it doesn't make all too much sense to get a more flat pen for at least a bit, or protection reduction, because you're looking for squishy targets and not tanks. So at that point it makes more sense to build into something that either gives you power or is some sort of fundamental part to your character's, your mage's kit. It could be something like Book of Thoth, where it doesn't matter all too much when you build it now. It used to matter more, but now you have this flexibility due to the fact that Spear of Desolation basically provides you with all the stats you would need otherwise. You could just get Gem of Isolation if that's something that's good for your mage. You could get Haste and Fatalis if you're playing a mage that can make use of that. You could just get any other power option, anti-option, maybe even Polynomicon if we're talking about more jungle-oriented characters like Ao Kuang. Or you could go for Spear of the Magus in third slot. There are situations where this is possible, where this is necessary, when you have two enemies that just suddenly started bulking up on magical defense and piling around mid lane. For example, if they have Hardwood and Gauntlet of Thebes maybe, and then another one has another magical defense item along with it, or the jungler went into magical defense, something along those lines where it would warrant you to get something against the magical defense. It should be a rarer case though. This should really be the place where you get your usual extra damage items that you would otherwise have built in the slot before that. Then after that, you want to go into Spear of the Magus in most situations, because this is the moment where players get tankier. And even if they're not that tanky, you will still want that extra flat pen to just take down those who have a little bit higher base values. If you already build it, you obviously go into one of the choices from before, whichever fits your character best. After that, you have Rod of Tahuti, which is just, you know, pretty much core for most gods. Not for every god, but let's just mention it here. And then, last but not least, you probably have like a situational item completely down to how the game's going. Could, for example, be an ethereal staff, could be an obsidian shard if you really need more tank shred, or it could be anything else that suits you. But you don't necessarily need to get more than the flat pen and the protection reduction that you have if the enemy team is not too tanky. That will be enough to get the protections low enough, even in late game, for you to deal your damage effectively. On that note, a little word on Demonic Grip. If you want to build Demonic Grip, which is fine, it synergizes much better with Spear of the Magus than Obsidian Shard ever could, then build it after Spear of the Magus. Spear of the Magus is better early because it's flat values, whereas Demonic Grip is better later because it's percentage values. And they both synergize on the gods that can make use of both. Then, if you were to start Magus, if we had a build where you would start with Sense of Time, Pen Boots and go straight into Magus, things would change just a little bit. In this case, I would also not advise to go into more pen right after, because I think at that point you would have enough protection shred for a while, even against anyone who's tanky. So this is where you would look for the similar power or flex option that we had in the build before in the same slot, just anything that suits your character. And then afterwards you would look for Spear of Desolation with the penetration, with the power, with the CDR to really get most of that item. It does have nice stats even without the pen, but the pen helps you a little more a little later into the game when the enemy actually has sufficient protections to fully abuse that. Then obviously you would go for Rod of Tahuti as well, and a situational like before for Sense of Time, just whatever fits your character. Many of these options here are really flexible because it depends so much on the character. For example, on Poseidon you would want Gem of Isolation or maybe even Hasten Fatalis, whereas on our Kwang you'd rather want Polynomicon, whereas on a more traditional mage like Thoth, for example, you would want Book of Thoth instead. So really what you want comes down to not only your god but also the game. But I think this is a good skeleton of how a build can look like implementing these new items in an effective way. And with that, thank you guys for watching. I hope this was insightful, I hope this was informative. If you enjoyed this content, I would very much appreciate if you click the subscribe button if you haven't yet, and maybe the bell next to it. It really helps me out. I will see you all for the next one tomorrow. ZiSotto, out.